Thank you so much, Phoebe, and thanks for the invitation to give this talk. Um, so yeah, today I'm going to speak about the role of home in human evolution. It's the subject of a book manuscript I'm working on. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions, and also, feel free to get in touch with me with feedback via email after the talk. So kind of the central question, research question guiding this is, when did humans begin to use home-like spaces, and how did they shape our evolution? So what was the coevolutionary process between the coevolution of humans with the home? We know that by the end of the Pleistocene, or the late Pleistocene, humans, especially in the Upper Paleolithic, for example, humans were living in constructed dwellings with a central hearth. They were often decorated, their walls with engravings, so either in rock shelters or actual built structures. And the Upper Paleolithic dwellings can really resemble something that we really could describe as a home today. But other great apes do not use home-like spaces. They build nightly nests and sleep in trees or on the ground in the case of gorillas. But they might return to the same area, but they don't go back to the same nest. They build a nest every night. So how did we get from there to here? How did this home-like space, how did it form throughout human evolution, and what kind of and how did it help guide human evolution as well? So first, I'm going to back up and ask the question: what am I talking about when I say the home? I used to kind of shy away from this particular term, but now I've kind of embraced it. And the thing is that people tend to think about, when they think of home, they think of the word house, and these two words can be used synonymously in many, in English. But when I refer to the home, my definition is more broad. So it encompasses the indoor and outdoor spaces used in a variety of cultures and climates. So it could be compounds for multiple generations of families, or in the cases of mobile peoples, campsites, which might consist of multiple family units. And so this is kind of what I'm referring to when I talk about the home in the Paleolithic. Really, I'm talking about these home bases that have been referred to by archaeologists. And so the home is really important to human societies on multiple levels. At the very basic level, in economic definition, it's considered the building block of human societies where resources are pooled. It's also a place where culture is reproduced and enacted through our daily routines. And it's where our children grow and where they're enculturated. And so today, homes are symbolic representations of both our cultural and individual identities. But they're also obviously very complicated, dynamic settings. And so the term is laden with cultural baggage. That's why a lot of people have avoided it in the past. But I find that fact really interesting, and I think that it also signals the importance of the home in human lives. So all of these reasons play into why the home is so important in human evolution. So it's a site of, most importantly, perhaps, it's a site of cooperative parenting. It's really important for kin bonding, for both real and fictive kin. It helps to strengthen social bonds. It's a site of cultural transmission and social learning. So it's where we learn technical and social skills. And of course, that's super important, and that's very much related to this idea of the fact that all the children are there and the babies. So it's it's been referred to as a child's first world. So that's where they're learning to be, fully human in terms of within a culture. We can also see habits. We have a lot of daily practices, a lot of habits that are happening within home settings. So we can and that's important from an archaeological point of view, because it makes these kind of repeated activities really visible. And then, of course, the home is really important in terms of as a place to pool resources and to store items. You know, the size of the household can really vary depending on the culture, but the various members of a household have different roles. So there's a division of labor in terms of which resources they contribute. Of course, today in industrialized societies, that essentially translates to labor or money. But in the past and in other parts of the world, it means things like different types of foods, raw materials, firewood, water, finished items, etc. And of course, knowledge and know-how are also pooled. So we have both the pooling of abstract resources, but also a lot of necessary things, much of which can be stockpiled for future needs. So here's the timeline of the talk I'm going to give. I mean, this is obviously the timeline of human evolution, but like the way I break it up is I talked about it in 3 phases. So I have phase 1, which contributes to the earliest part of the archaeological, well, first, the earliest part of the fossil record, so beginning with our last common ancestor and the earliest archaeological record, corresponding essentially to the late Miocene, Pliocene, and lower Pleistocene. Then the second phase that I see is really important in this coevolutionary relationship is the middle Pleistocene. And then the final phase would be the late Pleistocene. So as you can see, I've kind of like broken up the development of the house and the coevolutionary role of the home with human evolution in a way that's not divided at, you know, the lower, middle, and upper Paleolithic boundaries. It kind of corresponds better to you know, the changes in the environment. And also it allows me to kind of not focus on these transitions and you look at the record in kind of a different perspective instead of always just, you know, comparing the Middle Paleolithic to Upper Paleolithic as these like whole units. So we could begin though with last common ancestor. So most paleoanthropologists agree that it's very likely that our last common ancestor also used nests, slept in nests, just like chimpanzees and other great apes. And so these nests provide protection from predators and also may help with thermal regulation. So probably our earliest ancestors were also sleeping in nests. So this first phase, beginning with our last common ancestor up till about 800,000 years ago, is defined by the earliest, is where we see the earliest pooling of resources. We see the origins of cooperative parenting, the first limited use of fire, because fire is obviously a very important component of the home. And then we also just see that, you know, technology is obviously getting increasingly important throughout this phase. So of course, like this question about, or this topic about the earliest home bases is something that has a long history in anthropological inquiry from Sherwood Washburn, Glenn Isaac, Owen Lovejoy, and on from there. And so in the past, you know, the eating of meat was seen as being a major impetus because it comes in large packages and then it can be shared to kind of start getting you know, this groups together in like home base and settings. But there are other things too that may have been an initial push towards resource pooling. And Sarah Hrdy in particular argues for the role of cooperative parenting. So, you know, with chimpanzees, infants cling to their mothers for a long time. And so as our hominin ancestors became more bipedal, this would have affected the ability for infants to cling for long periods of time. Obviously, this is like a slow transition, but the foot is changing. And therefore, while that maybe they were in their very small babies, they still are able to cling for some period of time. Eventually, they're going to lose the ability to cling. And also, you know, as the foot changes in morphology, it's going to be lose those abilities as well. So like if your baby can't cling on to you all the time, like what to do with one's baby, that's going to just add some an extra incentive to have helpers. In addition, you know, there's the loss of body hair that's also going to contribute here. Furthermore, another related kind of push towards resource pooling would be changes in our diet. So our earliest ancestors were transitioning from a diet of fruits and leaves to increasingly hard foods. This would have required pre-mastication or processing in some way for weaning infants. And so again, this kind of first, Sarah Hrdy talks about this kind of first sharing between, you know, the mother and her offspring in terms of pre-masticated foods, and then it can eventually you may have others sharing with the infants as well. We also, around this period, see the first archaeological sites where we see both faunal remains and food processing tools. We can think about the role of the sites in the lives of humans. At first, these sites like FLK Zinj are located near sources of water and places where a lot of animals also like to frequent. So there are likely favored locations that are archaeologically visible because of and we see the co-occurrence of bones and stone tools. But even at some sites, we can see numerous occupations taking place, like Kanjara South, where we see tools used on both meat and plants, and raw materials moved as much as 10 kilometers. But essentially through this time, and especially into the Acheulean, we see like just a greater reliance on technology, and we see an increase in denser accumulation of tools and manufacturing debris. So they're returning to certain locations more often and also staying there for longer, signaling that these places are starting to have a greater role in people's lives. And also starting with Homo erectus, we can surmise that probably they are no longer sleeping in the trees, but on the ground. And so, but it would have probably been a gradual process where we see the coexisting of sleeping locations and eating locations. But essentially, so we just see a more clustered use of landscape use throughout this period. And then, of course, by the time we get to around 800,000 years ago, we have sites like Gesher Ben Yaakov, where we have, you know, certain sites where there's a lot of different activities occurring in one place. Okay, so now we know that by the time we get to phase 2, we have this much more clustered use of the landscape. So people are stopping in particular locations, staying there for longer, probably pooling labor to some. There's some element of cooperative parenting is likely. And when we get to phase 2, corresponding to the Middle Pleistocene, some of the major things that happen during this period as fire use becomes much more widespread. Caves and rock shelters are used much more consistently. I argue that cultural norms regarding resource pooling become more formalized, and I'll talk about that in a second. And perhaps we have more of a transition to a home base. We have the transition to a home-based system during this period. So the thing about caves and rock shelters that I found really interesting is that caves and rock shelters imply that hominids are placing more emphasis on the location of their home bases. So instead of just having, you know, a place like a home base or a place where they frequent next to a raw material source or a water source, caves and rock shelters are locations where stuff needs to be brought to. They're usually not, they could be, but in most cases, they're not necessarily right next to these natural resources. And so it shows that now the home is being treated as a resource itself. So these are places where raw materials and other things you have to bring stuff to there. So here's just one example of Camp de l'Argot in France. We have major occupations beginning 600,000 years ago, but the fire use really doesn't begin until 350,000 years ago. This slide is just to remind me to kind of point out the importance of fire in the coevolutionary relationship between the home and humans. Obviously, the fire was an incredible breakthrough in innovation in human evolution and was particularly important in the home. The home may have had its incipient beginnings before the use of fire became widespread, but the use of fire was probably a catalyst for the transformation of the home and into an essential part of hominid lives. So its use of source of warmth to detract predators, for cooking, pyrotechnologies as a source of light to attend the day. All of these things serve to extend the time people stayed in their living spaces and diversified the types of activities that were performed there. And so there's scattered evidence for fire earlier in the lower Paleolithic, but it isn't until the late lower Paleolithic that we really see consistent evidence for fire use, particularly in rock shelters and cave sites. And so we can think of this time period as a crucial time when the adoption of this technology is coalescing and the use of fire is beginning to have a larger impact on human society. So I'll use Taboon Cave to illustrate some of these changes. So as you surely know, Taboon is a deeply stratified site spanning the lower and middle Paleolithic with a record that begins around 415,000 years ago. And so this period, this late lower Paleolithic, around 400 to 250,000 years ago, is particularly interesting. And of course, the Levant has a number of important sites that date to this period, not just Taboon, but also Kesem and Mycelia. And in this area, the late lower Paleolithic is characterized by the Acheulean lithic technology, which has some precocious features like early blade use. And many of these sites also display habitual fire use. So here we have, at Taboon, we have the use of fire beginning, evidence for the use of fire around 350,000 years ago. So here we have a histogram of the amount of burned flints. And so you can see that midway through the lower Paleolithic layers, we have an increase in the amount of burned flints. And these are often clustered in a way that might suggest the location of previous fire structures. So that begins around 350,000 years ago, very roughly. And then it stays more or less consistent in the lower Paleolithic, and then around through the early middle Paleolithic, and then around the middle of the middle Paleolithic, 165,000 years ago, we have a big uptick, showing again that probably these places were being occupied for much longer periods of time. So during the late lower Paleolithic at Taboon, it seems like occupants are using fire, but I wanted to know what sorts of occupations this fire use is associated with. Is it associated with longer duration occupations, for example? And do we see any changes in the way the site was used? So in order to study this is work I did long time ago for my master's thesis. I compared the tool to flake ratio and the artifact density, which is a common way to look at examine mobility within archaeological sites. I compared that for the layers at Taboon. There's over 90 layers, so it was really a great site to do this. I surprisingly found that although the middle Paleolithic layers followed this expected pattern, so here we have this expected pattern where we have layers that are very high in tool to flake ratio, but low in artifact density, essentially are likely times when people are not staying very long at the site. whereas because they're not bringing a lot of raw materials there to nap. Whereas when you have really high artifact densities and low tool to flake ratio, so essentially low tool frequencies, that that implies that probably people are bringing a lot of stone material to, and then napping it there at the site. And once you start napping nodules of flint, the debris will quickly overwhelm the amount of tools you have. And so that just shows that probably people are staying longer. And so this kind of relationship, this negative relationship between either tool to flake ratio or tool frequency, both are saying kind of the same thing, the amount of tools relative to debris. Compared to artifact density, we're going to have this negative relationship. But the lower Paleolithic layers, you can see here, just did not show that expected pattern. In fact, the tool to flake ratio is just consistently high, no matter the artifact density. So it didn't seem to show this kind of pattern of when people are staying longer, they tend to bring more chunks of raw material there, provision the site more, or do more napping. Whereas when they're there for shorter periods of time, they're just kind of probably staying there and discarding their mobile toolkit and not staying long enough to bring a bunch of materials back to the site to nap. So this has been bothering me for this whole time, or since I did my master's thesis. And I started to notice that actually like a lot of lower Paleolithic sites have really high tool to flake ratios. And so I started going through the literature and compiling the tool to flake ratios at a bunch of sites. And so here are just a few that I've compiled. We have Ubadia, Condalargo, Karen Cave in Turkey, the lower Paleolithic layers. Here's my lower Paleolithic layers from Tebboune, Jebel Arud, and then it kind of drops down. Now I have I've added some more sites, but I didn't have time to make it is nice, but you can see here I've added some more sites. Here's the lower Paleolithic, the late lower Paleolithic, or well, full on lower Paleolithic, because I have Wonderwork in here too. And then we have the middle and upper Paleolithic. And I've been trying to add some more sites to this just to make sure it's like a comparison. So there is some messiness, but there's a clear shift from a much higher tool to flake ratios to lower tool to flake ratios. And what I think this is showing is just that there's provisioning the site with raw materials, bringing materials back to the site is something that didn't really happen until the beginning of the middle Paleolithic. So there are some sites where that if they happen to be really close to raw material sources, you get much higher or much lower tool to flake ratios. But at sites where they actually need to be provisioned, that seems to be a pattern of behavior that begins with the middle Paleolithic. And another thing that's happening at the same time is we also see a shift in cultural norms regarding meat sharing, or potentially a shift in cultural norms. So this is work that was conducted by Mary Steiner, but some others have contributed to this data set as well. So Mary Steiner looked at the cut mark orientations and bones from Kesem Cave, so this late lower Paleolithic site in Israel, and compared it to cut marks on bones at Uchazla Caves 1 and 2, so middle and upper Paleolithic sites in Turkey, also in the Levant, and in the southern part of Turkey. And she found that whereas with the cut marks at Kesem Cave, they were heavy-handed and they were often crossing, overlapping and multi-directional, whereas the cut marks for the middle and upper Paleolithic were often parallel and they were positioned in strategic locations for skilled butchery. And so Steiner postulates that what we're seeing here is the emergence of cultural norms related to meat sharing. So cross-culturally, the butchery and distribution of meat from large animals is strictly dictated by cultural norms. So you have particular individuals or groups that are given particular cuts of meat based on the social norms within any given group. And so it's highly standardized. And she and so Steiner thought, in the lower Paleolithic, meat was definitely being shared, high quality body parts were being brought back to the site, but they were, but the standardized social norms of meat sharing was not that. It was kind of more like a free for all. Everyone's just kind of probably cutting off meat for their own portion, whereas in the Middle Paleolithic layers, it looks like it was butchered by one skilled individual. And the same pattern was also found in the Lower Paleolithic site of Shunigan by Britt Starkovich, and also it also was corroborated by Middle and Upper Paleolithic data research in France by Marie-Cécile Soulier. So it actually seems like it's a much more widespread pattern than just in the Levant. And so to place these two pieces of evidence together, I think that what we're seeing here is the emergence of some cultural norms related to provisioning first. So now we're seeing that people are bringing back knappable stone for communal tool making on site, beginning in the Middle Paleolithic. And also the fact that people are using fire more regularly and it upticks in the Middle Paleolithic, that's also going to imply that people just are going to have to be provisioning these sites with more resources, aka firewood, because you have to continuously feed these fires. And I think that maybe what we can see here is the commitment to an exclusive central place foraging model. So whereas before, there was probably some central place foraging going on, now where there's bringing back some portions of meat, for example, but there is not like a full commitment to this home-based model, and this may be occurring in the Middle Paleolithic, where we're now seeing numerous different types of material being brought back and shared communally at the site. And now we also see, and so these cultural norms perhaps are indicating that this is something that you kind of must do to be a group member. Also, we see that there's probably some cultural norms originate related to sharing. So now one person is butchering and dividing the carcasses. The pieces of meat are doled out. Maybe this means that they're being doled out till we have a ascribed kin. So once you have certain people that you have to give certain pieces of meat to. So this all implies increased cooperation during this period, a kind of increased coherence in these groups. So in general, we see these cultural norms related to sharing, group membership, and perhaps some sort of roles. So perhaps like the beginnings of some division of labor. Okay, and then we get with phase 3 beginning in the late Pleistocene, so beginning at with MAS stage 5, where we see just kind of like an explosion in population throughout many parts of Africa and Eurasia. And so we can see during this period these large and highly interconnected populations in some regions. We see different cultures that can be identified archaeologically. Homemaking behaviors become much more widespread, and homes are functioning as important nodes in highly planned and strategic land use systems. So I kind of think of phase 2 as kind of by the time you get to the end, like the very beginning of the Middle Paleolithic, we are kind of primed, ready to kind of for a lot of changes to happen. And then you get like the warming happening in stage 5E and the explosion of population, and just in many areas we're able to kind of like take off in terms of use of the home and cultural development. Okay, so we also see, not only did we see that shift in provisioning in the into the Middle Paleolithic, we can also see some shifts in provisioning lithic raw materials within the Upper Paleolithic. This is work by Steve Kuhn, and so he saw both during his dissertation work on the Tyrian coast of Italy, but also he saw this kind of a shift again in Uchazla Cave in Turkey. And essentially what he was able to do in both of these locations, they were really strategic, or they were really great places because they had, both of them are located in right near the coast, so on the shore of the Mediterranean Sea in both cases. And you have the local raw material is cobbles, and so it's rolled cortex, and then you have more distant raw material and it's fresh cortex. So it's really like an ideal place to look the difference between local and distant raw materials. And he found that he saw a subtle shift that in the Italian sites and the Tyrrhenian coast, that there was simply higher percentages of fresh cortex in the upper Paleolithic layers than in the middle Paleolithic layers. And he concluded that this really came down to planning. So the upper Paleolithic foragers knew where they were headed and strategically geared up with high quality raw materials in the upland before heading down to the coast. Whereas the middle Paleolithic foragers visited these locations, but they didn't have this highly structured and planned seasonal rounds like the upper Paleolithic groups. And then furthermore, at Uchazla, Steve found proportions of non-pebble cortex rose over time. And that by the Akhmarian, so this is happening, and so here's the earlier Upper Paleolithic, but then by the later Akhmarian, they were deliberately provisioning the site with this high quality distant raw materials from the uplands. So the thing is I guess what we see in the Upper Paleolithic is that there's many times where people are still just using the local raw materials, but there's you just see greater diversity in the types of planning and provisioning that is occurring. So in some places, there are these deliberate decisions to provision certain sites with raw materials from further afield, and you just don't see that earlier in time. So the main point here is that homes are becoming really nodes in these sophisticated land use systems. And this is a transition that happens throughout. It's not just at the middle of Upper Paleolithic boundary, but it's kind of something that's happening throughout this time. We also, of course, during this time, see the formation of these large-scale social networks, mostly rendered in the use of beads, but also we can see early beads showing that there's probably these that you are now kind of signaling social identity to people, to various groups. Also, we see these, tool types become really specific and showing just a greater diversity in terms of cultural groups and identity making rendered through archaeological object or, cultural material culture. Then, of course, in the Aurignacian, but also in other periods, we have within the greater Aurignacian culture, we can actually, many studies have shown that there's actually smaller material culture can identify smaller subcultural groups. Again, showing that we have maybe different ethnic groups or language groups. So the cultural systems and institutions are certainly in place by this time. And alongside that, so we can also see this kind of cultural identity making or cultural practices. We can see this also rendered in homemaking regimes. So we see, for example, in South Africa, the application of floor and bedding to rock shelters. The earliest use is at Border Cave in South Africa around 200,000 years ago, but it's also found still at Border Cave, but also at later in time at the sites of Sibudu and Deep Kloof as well, around 80 to 70,000 years ago. So we see this repeated practice at several different sites of this application of ash, which is then covered with grasses. And then when they, revisit the site, this is burned and reapplied, and specifically picking out certain types of vegetation that are insect resistant. So it's this kind of homemaking regime that we see used in this particular region. We can also see culturally specific homemaking practices in the Aurignacian, in several Aurignacian rock shelters in the Weser Valley of France. And so all of these sites all of these rock shelter sites preserve thick Aurignacian deposits right on top of bedrock that all date to around 35 to 38,000 years ago. So at the site of Abri-Castanet, we found this multi-component fire feature. Here we have unit 217, which is the site, which was the main site of burning. Then there was an overflow hearth, 218, where where burn material was moved during some cleaning. There was kind of like an overflow hearth, and then we had structure 216, where it shows this is where you have like still burning embers were moved to do specific behaviors. And this evidence was found using magnetic susceptibility tests. And so this was a really cool feature because it displayed a very sophisticated use of heat and the management of luminosity, sophisticated use of fire and the management of luminosity and heat. But we were even more surprised when we cleaned the bedrock of the nearby site of Abri-Cellier, and we found a very similar configuration. Now, this site Abri-Cellier had been nearly emptied in the early 20th century excavations. And so, sorry, this photo is not the best, but we found these two fire-reddened depressions that were very similar to 217 and 218. And right nearby, we found this smaller kind of cavity that was completely filled with burned bone, looking just like the feature of 216 at Abri-Castanet. And a similar configuration was documented by Louis Didon at Abri-Blanchard and by Halley and Movius at Abri-Pateau. So in addition to these very similar configurations of hearth features, these sites all share other features in common as well. So one is parietal art, such as this auroch we found at Abri-Blanchard, these pierres à anneaux, so the rings dug through the rock shelter, through the limestone, usually along the drip line of the rock shelter. And these have been theorized to maybe perhaps hold skins up to kind of block out completely enclose these rock shelters. These rock shelters aren't that high, just several meters tall, so that's actually would have been doable. And we know that at Abri-Castanet, at least, it was occupied during the winter months, so this would have been really important for the retention of heat and light. And so here we can see this is a drawing by the French artist Eric Lebrun, and this is how he envisions how it may have looked. But the significance of these Weser Valley site is not only that these Aurignacian groups having a sophisticated use of fire, or they were decorating their sites with figurative art, or they were perhaps enclosing these spaces with skin. But to me, it's really this biggest significance for my understanding of this coevolutionary relationship of the home. It really seems like these sites all appear to have followed a kind of cultural blueprint for what constitutes a home, down to the configuration of the hearth. And so all of these sites are situated within about 10 kilometers along the Weser, and they would have all been recognizable to other group members as home. So I think this is very something that it can be very identifiable to us today as home. We can also see during this time in the Upper Paleolithic, we can find there various sites where different household units can be identified. So at like Dolden Stanici, for example, or Ponsable, where it looks like different households. And so this is very similar to what we can see in most foraging societies today and historically. And these contexts with different household units being kind of segregated, this is really especially conducive for the innovation and the buildup of cumulative culture, because you can have certain types of information are shared with the whole community, and then you can have kind of separate trajectories of innovation going on simultaneously, and then these two things are then recombined. So one household unit might do a particular something a little bit differently than another household unit, and then they can kind of come together and recombine these kinds of information. So by the time you get to this division of household units, this is really going to help kind of spur on and accelerate cumulative culture. And we can kind of see that happening within the Upper Paleolithic. So to summarize these three phases, we have this phase one, where we have the kind of from our last common ancestor to 800,000 years ago, where we have these first kind of impetuses to kind of have people draw together, have hominids revisit certain locations on the landscape. So we just see sort of smaller changes in mobility patterns that are going to trend to a more clustered use of space, where we have various types of resources being pooled. These resources could be the sharing of food, but also resources like the shared care of like more abstract resources, such as shared care of offspring. So we're going to have, this is the earliest cooperative breeding, food sharing, and the use of technology, because of course, when you, technology is going to inherently cluster your use of space, simply because you need those resources. You're going to have to go back to these places to get those raw material resources to make these items. And so again, yeah, they increasingly become more clustered. And then we have phase two, where we have it's corresponding to the Middle Pleistocene. Caves and rock shelters are increasingly being utilized, showing that these home-like spaces are becoming a resource in and of itself. So you're kind of going out of your way to go to different locations and not just kind of go next to a raw material. You're going to find a sheltered space. We also see the increase in fire use, which is going to accelerate this whole process and make these particular locations more and more attractive to gathering and spending longer periods of time in these home-like spaces. And then around 250,000 years ago, where we have the earliest Middle Paleolithic, that's when we see these increases in provisioning, the emergence of cultural norms related to group membership, and just higher levels of cooperation in general. Finally, in phase three, from beginning with the oxygen isotope stage 5, we have in the late Pleistocene, we have these identifiable cultural norms related to of homemaking. We can see symbolic attachment to place rendered in artistic expressions in not only just in home-like spaces, but in other spaces. So we see these attachments to not only homes, small, like in terms of campsite type things, but maybe homescapes, like larger landscapes. We see the home as functioning in a large scale social networks. So it's an important place in those regards. And finally, in this final phase, we do see the partitioning of household units becoming increasingly visible in the archaeological record again, and that's all of these things are kind of going to be feeding in to social learning, and the accumulation of culture. So just to kind of summarize again, we see the role of the home being very important as a hub of cultural transmission and social bonding. It's a site of cooperative parenting. As I've reiterated many times, it's this place where we see the pooling of resources, but also the storage of resources and tools. So because technology is so important, we need a lot of stuff to make these tools. And even in settings where we are mobile, we're moving from one place to another, there is the necessity of having the raw materials to make things, and those need to be brought to a different, and you're also combining different materials together. So these need to be brought to a common location, and that's also going to feed into the importance of these centralized locations. So ultimately, the home and humans, they co-evolve together, and so that now they're irrevocably intertwined, and we can argue that it's hard to be fully human without a home. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.